Imagine boarding a flight, walking confidently into the first-class cabin, your seat already paid for. But the moment you settle in, the room shift's eyes narrow, whispers rise, and a lead flight attendant steps forward with words sharper than any storm outside. What happens when a successful black man, calm and composed, is told he does not belong in the seat he bought? How does dignity survive when challenged not by facts, but by assumptions? This is not just a story about one flight. It's about a lifetime of being seen as less than, of carrying the weight of silent judgment while quietly proving your place over and over again. What happens when one man chooses to stay seated, refusing to be erased? Even as the world watches, who truly holds the power in moments like these, the man in the seat, or those trying to move him? And what does it say about the systems and people we trust every day? This story takes place entirely on a plane, yet it echoes far beyond the clouds. Get ready to witness courage in stillness, dignity under fire, and a quiet revolution that no one saw coming. Like, share, and subscribe now, because the story is just beginning. The morning sun broke gently across the runway at Oakland International Airport, casting a golden glow on the tarmac as the hustle of Terminal C moved with practiced urgency. Flight 229 to San Francisco was a short hop, but for some on board, it would become the longest journey of their lives in just under an hour. At gate C-12, a boarding announcement echoed through the concourse. Passengers gathered near the jet bridge, scanning boarding passes, sipping overpriced coffee, and shifting bags from shoulder to shoulder. Among them was a man who didn't draw attention, but couldn't be ignored either. Isaiah Monroe adjusted the strap of his leather briefcase as he walked toward the gate, his shoes echoing softly against the polished tile. He wasn't flashy. His charcoal gray blazer fit like it was made for him. His white shirt was crisp, collar sharp. No logo screamed for attention. No entourage followed him. No one noticed the subtle monogram stitched into the cuff of his sleeve. It simply read, The gate agent scanned his ticket. A green beep. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe," she said politely. He nodded with a quiet smile. "Good morning." Isaiah stepped into the jet bridge, inhaling the sterile scent of recirculated air and new upholstery. It reminded him of boardrooms and hotel lobbies, of years spent crossing time zones in silence. But this time, he was traveling alone. No assistant, no company announcement, no security team, just him, the seat he paid for, and the calm he carried like armor. He entered the aircraft, greeted by the subtle chime of boarding music. First class was mostly empty. Only 2 passengers had taken their seats, both white men in their 50s, both already absorbed in their newspapers. Isaiah walked forward and located seat 2A, window seat, plenty of legroom. He opened the overhead bin, placed his briefcase inside with care, and eased down into the leather seat. He exhaled once, slowly. His eyes drifted toward the window, watching the dance of luggage carts and fuel trucks move below. For a moment, it felt normal, until it didn't. "Excuse me, sir." A voice cut through the air, clipped and controlled. Isaiah turned slightly. A woman stood just beyond the row, blonde hair pinned back in a strict bun, navy blazer buttoned with precision, name tag centered like a badge, Veronica Steele. She wore the uniform like it was stitched to her personality, tight, sharp, and made to assert control. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass," she said without a smile. Isaiah blinked, then nodded. Of course. He reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and pulled out his phone. With a practiced tap, he displayed the digital boarding pass. She didn't move closer. She leaned in just enough to read, but not enough to be near. Her brow furrowed. "This is for first class." "Yes," Isaiah replied calmly. "Seat 2A. Veronica didn't say anything at first. Her eyes scanned the screen again, then a third time. She stepped back, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Please remain seated. I'll need to verify this with the gate." He gave a slight nod, then turned back to the window. Calm. But inside, something old stirred. He didn't sigh. He didn't roll his eyes. He just waited across the aisle. The man in 2C glanced up from his tablet. Douglas Price. He had the face of someone who believed everything he owned was earned and everything he didn't was stolen. He smirked as Veronica walked past. "Well," Douglas muttered under his breath. "First class sure is evolving." Isaiah didn't turn to face him. He'd learned long ago that some statements are invitations, and the best way to win is never to attend the party. 2 rows back, a young woman named Maya Ellington raised an eyebrow. She noticed the exchange. Quietly, she was traveling for work. A notebook already open on her lap, pen clipped at the edge. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just begun writing the most important story of her career. Veronica returned less than a minute later. This time, she wasn't alone. A younger flight attendant followed behind her, trying hard not to look nervous. Her name tag read Kimberly. Veronica's voice was firmer now. "Sir," she began, "we're having difficulty verifying your seat in the system. I'll need you to step into the galley so we can resolve the issue with the gate agent." Isaiah's hands remained folded neatly in his lap. "There's no need. You can resolve it here." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "I'm not asking." Isaiah tilted his head, not out of defiance, but precision. "I paid for this seat. I boarded without issue. There's no mistake." She drew in a breath, measured and laced with control. "If you do not comply, I will be forced to contact airport security." A pause. That was the line. That was the moment where stories break, where truths hide behind policies, where history repeats itself in uniforms and scripts. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. Instead, he reached into his blazer once more, pulled out his phone, and dialed. "Aria," he said softly. "Flight 229, gate C12. Bring the file." He hung up. No explanation, no details, just a name and a request. Veronica blinked. "Excuse me, who did you call my assistant?" Isaiah replied. "She'll be here shortly." Kimberly glanced between the two of them. Her face said what her lips couldn't. Something wasn't right. Veronica's mouth opened, but she didn't speak. The confidence in her posture wavered, just for a second, and in that second, something shifted. Passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. A phone was raised. The recording light blinked. The man in 2A remained seated, his hands still, his gaze soft. Because some fights aren't won by shouting. Some are won by staying still long enough for the world to notice who's moving against you. And just like that, the cabin wasn't quiet anymore. It was listening. It just didn't know what it would hear next. Isaiah Monroe had always been a man who believed in timing. Not just in the business sense, though he mastered that too, but in the deeper rhythm of life, the moments that come not when you expect them, but when you're ready to see them. So as he sat in seat 2A, leather armrest under his forearm, eyes still fixed out the small oval window beside him. The threat of being escorted off the plane didn't bring anger. It brought memory. It had been 26 years since his first flight. He was 18 then, not the polished executive he was now, but a teenager with a suitcase full of thrift store clothes, a wrinkled scholarship letter, and shoes so thin he could feel the cold press of concrete through the soles. He'd spent the night before on a friend's couch. Not a close friend, just someone who didn't ask too many questions. He remembered the gate agent eyeing his tattered duffel bag, scanning his boarding pass twice like she was sure it was a mistake. He remembered the flight attendant asking him to move to the back, convinced a boy like him couldn't possibly be in seat 6C, though the numbers on his ticket said otherwise. He'd moved back then, apologized, smiled awkwardly, sat quietly for the next 2 hours and never told anyone. Not his mother, who cried on the phone when she found out he'd landed safely. Not his mentor, who told him, "Go up there and show them who you are." He didn't share the moment because he didn't want them to worry, but he carried it. And now, 2 decades later, here it was again, wrapped in newer uniforms, presented with newer language, backed by newer systems, but the feeling hadn't changed. The assumption remained, you don't belong here. That sentence, unspoken but felt, followed him into boardrooms and hotels, into high-rise elevators and black-tie galas. It didn't matter how many zeros followed his name on a contract. To some, he'd always be questioned before he was acknowledged. But today wasn't about anger. It was about presence. He turned slightly and saw Veronica Steele still standing at the front of the cabin, tablet in hand, eyes locked onto the screen, pretending to search for something that would validate her actions. Isaiah could read her. She wasn't new to this role. She was confident, capable, and yet too practiced, too ready to perform authority rather than seek clarity. Next to her, Kimberly Dow fidgeted with a napkin. Her eyes flickered from Isaiah to the other passengers, clearly unsure of where her loyalty should land. She looked like someone still figuring out how the world worked, and today might be the first time she truly saw how. Isaiah shifted slightly in his seat. He could feel the tension now, a low hum beneath the air vents. The way passengers avoided making eye contact yet couldn't stop glancing over. He recognized the fear in some faces, the discomfort in others. A few held quiet curiosity, a few quiet agreement with Veronica, but most just waited, uncomfortable, but not enough to speak. In row 3, Maya Ellington sat straighter in her seat. Her fingers were already moving across her phone. Her journalist instincts triggered. She was supposed to be flying to meet a source in the Bay Area, but her mind was racing through phrases already, bias in the air, boarding while black, the two-way incident. She didn't know yet which title would stick, but she knew this was no longer just a flight. It was a moment. Douglas Price was less subtle. He chuckled again and leaned across the aisle slightly. "Man, if I pulled something like this," he said to no one in particular, "I'd be halfway to handcuffs by now." Kimberly turned to look at him. Her expression said what her voice couldn't. "Please stop." Isaiah didn't respond. He didn't flinch. Inside, his mind wasn't on Douglas. It was on Aria. She would be landing at the terminal any moment now. She knew what to bring. They'd talked about this months ago, not this incident specifically, but the possibility. Isaiah had insisted they conduct unscheduled culture audits across all vendors and subsidiaries. Not for press, not for show, just truth. Too many executives build systems based on perception. He built his on-lived experience, and that's why he'd chosen this flight, this day, this seat, alone, quiet, invisible, until someone forced him not to be. Veronica was talking now. Low tones, fast words into her radio. Isaiah couldn't hear the full exchange, but he caught a few phrases. Still waiting for confirmation. Not in the system. Might be fraud. Fraud. The word stung more than he expected. Not because it was new, but because it was always lurking nearby, even when dressed in success, even when wrapped in legitimacy. There were always those who would reach for that word when they had nothing else to stand on. He exhaled through his nose. Slow, intentional, in another life. Maybe he would have stood up, argued, shouted about rights and receipts. But Isaiah had learned something with time. The more power you hold, the softer you can speak. He turned his head as Kimberly approached again, holding a bottle of water. Her voice was soft. "Would you like something to drink?" "Sir." He looked up. Her eyes were different than Veronica's. They held conflict, but also sincerity, regret, maybe even recognition. "Thank you," he said. "Yes, water would be nice." She nodded quickly and walked to the galley. As she passed Veronica, she murmured something under her breath. Isaiah couldn't hear it, but the way Veronica's jaw tensed told him it wasn't approval. The tension in the cabin rose another degree. First class wasn't just watching now, it was waiting, suspended. Every shift of fabric, every click of a phone button, every breath felt louder than it should. And still. Isaiah said nothing. His silence was no longer empty, it was wait. A moment later, Kimberly returned with a cup of water on a napkin. She handed it to him with a quiet apology hidden behind her eyes. Isaiah accepted it with a nod. "Thank you, Ms. Dow." She froze slightly at the sound of her name, surprised he'd noticed. He smiled gently, almost imperceptibly, a reminder that respect travels both ways. Veronica stepped forward again, but her voice wasn't quite as sharp. "Not anymore." "Sir," she said, "we're still attempting to resolve the discrepancy. The system isn't showing a valid first-class seat under your name." Isaiah finally turned to look directly at her. "If the system is flawed," he said, "that's not my burden to carry. I have a ticket, I have a seat, and I have time." Veronica opened her mouth, but just then, Isaiah's phone buzzed once in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Aria had landed. A text appeared. "On my way to the gate." He put the phone face down on his tray table, then leaned back slightly, the kind of lean that says I'm not going anywhere. And, just like that, the balance shifted again. No words, just posture. Veronica didn't know it yet, but the moment was no longer hers. It was his. The air inside the cabin felt thicker now, like oxygen had to push through tension before reaching your lungs. Kimberly Dow moved down the aisle with a practiced grace, offering water to passengers who didn't ask for it, because doing anything felt better than standing still. She was no stranger to uncomfortable moments, but this was different. It wasn't turbulence or a delayed boarding. It was the kind of discomfort that settled in your chest and refused to leave. Isaiah Monroe sat quietly in seat 2A. He hadn't moved since his phone buzzed 5 minutes ago. His water, half finished, sat on the tray table beside the phone, which remained face down. His posture hadn't shifted, but something in the air had. No longer was he just a passenger. He was now the center of the room without saying a word, and everyone knew it. Veronica Steele stood near the galley, her jaw tight, arms folded. The tablet in her hand no longer felt like a tool. It felt like a shield. Her mind raced through protocols, procedures, policy numbers, anything that might justify what had started as a simple request but had spiraled into something she could no longer control. She looked toward the cockpit, willing the captain to intervene. He hadn't yet. That made her more nervous. Still no confirmation from the gate, Kimberly asked, approaching carefully. Veronica exhaled sharply through her nose. No, something's not syncing. They said they're checking the upgrade logs. Kimberly didn't respond. Instead, she glanced down the aisle toward Isaiah. Her gaze lingered, not in judgment, but in conflict. Then she turned and headed toward the galley again. 3 rows back, Maya Ellington had stopped pretending to check her emails. Her phone was already in camera mode, though still facing down. She hadn't hit record just yet, but she would. She knew timing mattered, and something told her this moment was still building. She scribbled a few words into the corner of her notebook. Wrong seat, right reason, policy or prejudice. Story of the year begins in row 2. Across the aisle, Douglas Price was watching everything with open amusement. He sat reclined, ankles crossed, a smug grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "This is why I don't fly commercial unless I have to," he muttered to the woman next to him, who kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, pretending not to hear him. Isaiah remained still. His silence was intentional now, not passive, not fearful. It was strategic. Let them speak. Let them show themselves. That was something his grandmother had taught him long ago. When the world tries to strip you of dignity, don't chase it. Stand still, and it'll find its way back to you. A sudden click at the front of the plane turned a few heads. The cockpit door cracked open, and out stepped Captain Ray Dawson, tall, silver-haired, with a face carved by wind and altitude. He wore authority like a second skin, but not the kind that demanded obedience, the kind that earned respect. He scanned the cabin quickly, assessing the tone of the air the way a seasoned pilot reads wind speed. He knew when a storm was brewing, and this one didn't start in the sky. "Everything all right here?" he asked, voice calm but firm. Veronica turned too quickly. "Captain, I'm just handling a situation regarding seat verification. Passenger in 2A doesn't appear on the current manifest." Captain Dawson's eyes shifted toward Isaiah. Recognition flickered across his features. "Mr. Monroe," he said, offering a slight nod. Isaiah stood slowly, not in challenge but respect. His expression remained unreadable. "Captain," he replied. The tension doubled. "You two know each other?" Veronica asked, a touch too sharply. "We've met," the captain answered. "Leadership Forum in Dallas. Last year, you gave the keynote on accountability culture in emerging markets." "That's correct," Isaiah said. The room shifted again. The air moved. Veronica hesitated, her eyes darting back to her tablet. "I wasn't aware we had VIPs on this flight," she said carefully. "You were aware you had passengers," Isaiah replied evenly. That should have been enough. Captain Dawson exhaled slowly, then turned back to Veronica. "Has he presented a valid boarding pass?" "Yes, but is he causing a disturbance?" "No, sir, but the tablet." The captain raised one hand slightly. "Then, unless security is requested for a legitimate threat, I recommend we treat Mr. Monroe, with the same respect we offer every first-class passenger. Veronica didn't respond immediately. She opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a voice from behind startled her. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. Standing at the cabin entrance was a woman dressed in a navy blue blazer with subtle gold trim, tailored slacks, and heels that clicked softly with each step. In one hand, she held a slim leather case. In the other, a phone. Her hair was pulled into a neat chignon. Her presence did not ask for attention. It expected it. Aria Westbrook. Veronica instinctively stepped forward, blocking her path. "I'm sorry, ma'am. This is a secure area." Aria raised one brow and calmly pulled out a badge clipped to her blazer. Aria Westbrook, Executive Vice President, Monroe Holdings. She let the pause do its work. Veronica blinked. "I'm here at Mr. Monroe's request, and I have the file he asked for." Captain Dawson stepped aside immediately. "Of course. Please, go ahead." Veronica didn't move at first. She was frozen, processing. Aria walked past her, unbothered, and approached Isaiah, handing him the case. He opened it gently, removed a folder, and placed it on the tray table in front of him. The Delta Air logo sat at the top of the document. Phase 3. Culture and Service Observation Report. Internal use only. Aria turned to Veronica, her voice still calm. "This wasn't meant to be an evaluation, but it seems your cabin turned itself into one." A hush spread through first class. Phones came out. Cameras turned on. Kimberly, standing behind Veronica, swallowed hard. Maya began recording. Veronica stammered, I wasn't informed of any corporate oversight. You weren't supposed to be." Aria replied, "This is real-world testing. We evaluate more than procedure. We evaluate presence and pattern." Veronica's face lost some color. She looked down at her tablet, but her hands trembled slightly. Isaiah didn't gloat. He didn't even look at her. He simply opened the folder and began reviewing the document. From the back of the cabin, a voice whispered, "Holy hell." Captain Dawson stood quietly beside Aria. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The message was already delivered. This wasn't just a passenger. This wasn't just a seat. This was a moment, and it had just escalated far beyond what anyone expected. Isaiah Monroe didn't lift his eyes from the document in front of him. The folder sat open on the tray table, each page cleanly organized, tabs marked in quiet colors, but it wasn't the paper he was focused on. It was the ripple beneath it. The slow, silent shift of a room that had turned from accusation to observation. He could feel the difference, the way a storm feels just before it breaks. Not loud yet, but alive with energy. His fingers traced the edge of the report, not reading it, just feeling it, somewhere in the back of the plane. He could hear Kimberly Dow whispering to another flight attendant, her voice taut with emotion. In front of him, Captain Dawson still stood, arms folded. He hadn't left the aisle. He was staying put, not because he didn't trust the situation, but because he didn't want to miss what came next. Aria had moved to the side now, her phone in hand, tapping a message to the external counsel team. Her expression hadn't changed. Calm, focused. But Isaiah could see the calculation in her gaze. She was already 10 steps ahead. That's why he trusted her. And yet, even with all of that support, Isaiah felt the familiar weight pressing in again. What if I had spoken louder? What if I had matched Veronica's tone from the start? Would I be in handcuffs now? Would this be a different kind of viral video? He didn't want to admit it, but the thought haunted him. Not because he didn't believe in his right to stand firm, but because history had taught him the cost of doing so. He remembered a meeting in Dallas 4 years ago. A senior executive at a partner firm had confused him for a driver. Despite his tailored suit and briefcase, he'd smiled, corrected him, even shaken the man's hand afterward. And yet, in the elevator ride down, he had stared at his reflection and wondered, why do I keep making space for people who shrink mine now? Here he was again, a different city, a different face, the same lesson. He took a sip of water and leaned back. Across the aisle, Douglas Price was still seated, still smug, but quieter now. His arms were crossed, and the corner of his phone screen glowed. He was recording, just as Maya Ellington was. But while Maya's camera captured the truth, Douglas's lens was looking for something else, something he could spin, something to confirm the biases he hadn't yet confessed to himself. Isaiah didn't fear him, not anymore. But there was a moment, a flicker that passed through Isaiah's chest, a question he couldn't quite shake. What if none of this had happened? What if Veronica had simply smiled, checked his ticket, and moved on? Would that have been better? Would silence have meant progress? Or would it just mean nothing had changed at all? He hated that the question existed. He hated more that he knew the answer. It would have meant nothing. It would have meant the system was still hiding itself behind politeness. Isaiah's phone buzzed again. He glanced down. A text from Aria. Media requests are starting. NPR, Vox, CNBC. Do we respond yet? He typed back quickly. Not yet. Let them talk. Let them reveal what they really think. He put the phone back on the tray and closed the folder slowly. The sound was soft, but somehow final. He turned to Captain Dawson. "Thank you," Isaiah said quietly. The captain gave a small nod. "You didn't need my help," he replied. "No," Isaiah said, "but it matters when someone speaks from inside the system." That was the thing people didn't understand about change. It wasn't just protests in the street. It was pressure inside the boardroom. It was truth whispered in the cockpit. It was the courage to say, "This isn't right," even when it meant shaking your own foundation. Behind them, Veronica was still standing. Her shoulders were tighter now. Her hands gripped the edge of the galley curtain like she was bracing for a wave. She hadn't spoken since Aria arrived. Her voice, once so confident, had been swallowed by the room. Kimberly approached her again, hesitant. "Should we begin service?" Veronica didn't answer at first. She just stared down the aisle at Isaiah. The man she'd tried to remove now sat surrounded by silence, respect, and unfolding truth. I said, "Verify his seat." She whispered, "I never said kick him off." Kimberly didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Veronica turned her head, eyes flashing, not in anger, but confusion, as if she was just realizing what had happened, what she had done. Isaiah turned his gaze back out the window. He remembered a poem his mother used to read to him, back when they didn't have much, when she worked 2 jobs and came home too tired to cook, but never too tired to read. The line came back to him now. Even when they close the door on you, walk through the wall they didn't know was there. He smiled faintly. He wasn't walking through walls today. He was sitting in the seat he paid for. And suddenly, that was more radical than any speech he'd ever given. Maya leaned forward, her phone now rolling. Mr. Monroe, she said softly. He turned, surprised at the use of his name. My name's Maya Ellington. I'm a journalist. I've been recording since the second confrontation. I just wanted to let you know. The footage is already being shared. He nodded once. People need to see this, she added. They need to feel it. He replied. Maya tilted her head, impressed by his calm. You're not angry. He smiled, but there was no joy in it. Anger burns quick, but truth settles, and it was settling now. In the seats around him, in the face of Kimberly Dow, who had watched the moment unfold and knew she had stood on the wrong side of it. In the silence of Veronica Steele, whose authority had unraveled without anyone yelling, just by someone choosing not to move. In the presence of Captain Dawson, who hadn't needed a memo or training module to recognize bias, and in the mind of Isaiah Monroe, who had lived 1,000 versions of this story and, for once, had stayed exactly where he was. Because some revolutions don't start with fire. They start with stillness, and the choice not to leave a seat that was never theirs to take away. Captain Ray Dawson had been flying commercial jets for over 32 years. He'd flown through thunderstorms, mechanical failures, emergency landings, and unruly passengers who thought the sky was theirs to command. But today, standing in the middle of the first-class cabin of Flight 229, he was facing a different kind of turbulence, one that didn't come from weather or altitude, but from inside the walls of the very system he'd trusted for decades. He watched as Isaiah Monroe calmly reviewed the document Aria had handed him. The man was poised, composed, deliberate, not defensive, not disruptive, just grounded. More grounded than most men Dawson had ever met at 35,000 feet. Veronica Steele, meanwhile, stood to the side like someone waiting for instructions she wasn't ready to receive. Her jaw was clenched, her fingers still wrapped around her tablet as if data might save her from judgment. And maybe that was the problem. Captain Dawson had seen too many people hide behind numbers and screens, forgetting that sometimes data tells a different story when you know how to read it. He stepped back toward the galley and gestured for Veronica to follow him. She hesitated, then did as she was told. Behind the curtain, the two stood in the narrow space, barely wide enough for one person to breathe. The low hum of the aircraft systems filled the silence between them. "Talk to me," Dawson said. Veronica didn't meet his eyes. There was a mismatch on the manifest. His name didn't appear in the first-class list when I checked the tablet. And what did you do? I asked for his boarding pass. It showed seat 2A, but I couldn't confirm it through the system. So I asked him to wait in the galley while I clarified. He refused. You asked him to step out of his paid seat based on a glitch. Dawson's voice remained calm, but his words were sharp. I followed protocol. No, he said firmly, you followed instinct, and you assumed the worst. Veronica finally looked up. I didn't mean I know, he interrupted. You rarely do. But what matters isn't just what you meant, it's what you did. He paused and let the weight of that settle. You know who he is now, but that shouldn't be the reason you're regretting it. Veronica swallowed hard. Captain Dawson had no interest in villainizing her. He knew her record. She was competent, respected, and usually measured. But he also knew that bias doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears a blazer and a smile and calls itself procedure. You need to step away from service for now, he said. I'll speak to base management once we land. She nodded silently and stepped out of the galley. eyes downcast, Kimberly Dow, who had been quietly listening near the jump seat, looked away quickly, not wanting to meet her gaze. Dawson lingered a moment longer, then walked back toward the cabin. The atmosphere had changed again. There was a kind of focused silence that filled the space. Not tension exactly, but attention. Everyone was watching. Not out of curiosity now, but accountability. Maya Ellington was still recording, her phone resting discreetly on the armrest. She wasn't just documenting anymore, she was witnessing, and she knew exactly what she was going to write. Isaiah looked up as the captain approached. "She'll be stepping away," Dawson said softly, "and I'll be filing a formal report." Isaiah gave a nod, respectful but distant. "Thank you," he replied. "She made a mistake," Dawson added. Isaiah looked him in the eye. "No, she revealed a pattern. That stopped the captain. Not because it was harsh, but because it was true." Isaiah gestured to the folder. "That's why I'm here. That's why we run these evaluations. Not to catch people, but to see if the environment we're investing in matches the values we claim to hold." Dawson nodded slowly. "And does it?" Isaiah didn't answer right away. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a black leather journal. He flipped it open, wrote a few quick notes in looping script, then looked back up. "We're still watching." The captain took that as both warning and invitation. He stepped aside as Arya returned to the row, her phone buzzing. She leaned down beside Isaiah. CNBC just aired a teaser. They're waiting for an official statement. NPR, too. Videos nearing 3 million views. Isaiah took a breath. "I'll let them wait. We're not done here." Arya nodded and stood back. From across the aisle, Douglas Price let out a small, bitter laugh. 3 million views for what a man getting a seat he already paid for. Welcome to the golden age of victimhood. His voice wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. Maya turned her camera toward him. Isaiah remained seated, still composed. "I didn't post anything," he said evenly. "No," Douglas snapped, "but you sure know how to let others do it for you." Isaiah looked at him for the first time all flight. "I've spent my entire life being told to stay calm, be polite, work twice as hard for half the credit. And now that someone finally pays attention, I'm accused of orchestrating it." Douglas scoffed. "Some of us built success without the pity party." Isaiah nodded. "You're right. You built your success while being seen. I built mine while being doubted. Every step of the way, there it was, not shouted, not dramatic, just truth. The kind that doesn't echo, it settles." The cabin went quiet again. Even the sounds from economy seemed to fade. Arya placed a hand gently on Isaiah's shoulder. "You okay?" "I'm fine," he said. But he wasn't. Not entirely. Because moments like this aren't victories. They're reminders that even with power, even with position, even with money and poise and discipline, you're still vulnerable to a question that white passengers rarely face. Do you belong here? And worse, the unspoken version, are you the mistake? He closed his eyes for a moment and listened. Not to the cabin, but to himself. He was tired, not from the confrontation, but from the fact that it wasn't surprising. He hadn't expected it today, but he hadn't ruled it out either. That was the quiet tax of navigating rooms not built with you in mind. He opened his eyes again. Calm returned. Dawson looked over from the cockpit door, meeting his gaze. Isaiah nodded. The flight would continue. But for everyone on board, Nothing would be the same again. Aria Westbrook stood at the edge of row 2, back straight, face unreadable, phone screen still buzzing in her hand. Her gold lapel pin shimmered faintly under the soft cabin lights. But her focus wasn't on attention. It was on control. Not the kind that demanded obedience, but the kind that settled things without raising a voice. She'd mastered that art years ago. The cabin had quieted to the point where you could hear the distant thrum of luggage being loaded. Most passengers had stopped pretending to be on their phones. Even those who didn't care at the beginning of the flight now watched closely, as if drawn by gravity to something they didn't yet fully understand. They were witnessing something personal but also public, something specific and yet painfully familiar. Aria tapped Isaiah Monroe gently on the shoulder. "May I?" Isaiah nodded without looking up. He was still staring at Douglas Price. Not out of anger, but clarity, the kind of gaze that comes from recognizing a fight that isn't worth winning, because the audience already sees what needs to be seen. Aria opened her leather case and removed a silver MacBook. She placed it carefully on the tray table in front of Isaiah, just to the side of the black folder. She flipped it open and typed in a secure password with quick precision. Within seconds, a PDF loaded, bold header, clear formatting. Brooks Westbrook, Holdings Culture and Service Observation. Flight Partner Program, internal use only. Do not circulate. Isaiah leaned forward, and Aria turned the screen slightly toward the aisle, making sure others could see without a word. Kimberly Dow, who was now standing just behind the galley curtain, tilted her head. Maya Ellington's eyes widened as she instinctively lifted her phone again, now capturing the screen. Aria scrolled slowly. "This wasn't supposed to be reviewed publicly," she said calmly. "But since the cabin has become the test case, let's be transparent." Her voice wasn't angry. It was something more dangerous to those who prefer silence. It was deliberate. She stopped scrolling on page 17. Recurrent patterns of racial profiling in premium travel services, observation period 2021-2024. She paused, then read aloud. Over a 3-year period, our internal audit team documented 313 cases involving passenger discrimination directly related to race or perceived social status. 72% occurred in first-class or priority boarding zones. Veronica Steele was standing near the back galley now, frozen. She had moved there after Captain Dawson told her to step aside, but she hadn't expected this. Not numbers, not patterns, not names. Aria continued. The most common markers of discriminatory incidents include unverified identity challenges despite valid tickets, assumption of ticket fraud, differential tone and posture, and escalation threats absent of passenger misconduct. She scrolled down once more, revealing another block of text. Of all cases reviewed, only 14% led to mandatory retraining. Fewer than 4% resulted in formal disciplinary action. The air changed again. This time, not from confrontation, but from exposure. Passengers looked around, not just at Isaiah, but at each other, as if wondering how many times they had witnessed similar moments and looked away, as if asking themselves whether they'd ever been Veronica or Douglas, or worse, silent. Isaiah folded his hands and spoke softly, not looking at the laptop, but at the people. You see, this wasn't about me being in the wrong seat. It was about the assumption that I couldn't possibly be in the right one. His voice wasn't bitter. It was clean, as if washed in years of rehearsing the sentence silently. This isn't the first time it's happened to me. It's just the first time you were all watching." Maya swallowed hard. She felt the weight of that land in her chest. She'd reported on police reform, education inequality, housing bias, but this was intimacy in motion, a man being stripped and redressed in public, not physically, but socially, from respectable to suspect, from businessman to question mark, until the system realized who he was and shifted back too late. Douglas Price finally spoke again, but softer this time. So now we're turning travel into a PR stage. Aria looked up, slowly. "Mr. Price, you submitted a commercial real estate proposal to our East Coast office 3 years ago. It was denied." Douglas blinked. She continued. "It was flagged due to questionable zoning recommendations and contracts that targeted vulnerable tenants. You were blacklisted from our future partnerships." The silence in the cabin wasn't shocked. It was surgical. Aria turned back to Isaiah. "Would you like to add anything?" Isaiah considered that for a long moment, then said, "Just one thing." He turned to face the cabin. "Some of you might think this is about race, and it is, but not only. This is about assumptions, about what people see when they look at you and what they expect you not to be." He looked down at the report, then back up. "I've spent years designing systems, advising boards, negotiating global equity projects, but no matter how far I travel, I always end up back in the same seat, the one where someone decides I don't belong." He smiled faintly. "So I stayed in this one. Today." Kimberly stepped forward then, water bottle in hand, as if the only thing she could offer was hydration and regret. "Mr. Monroe," she said softly, "would you like something else?" Maybe sparkling, Isaiah looked up at her. Her voice was sincere, her eyes conflicted. "Still is fine," he said. She nodded and walked back toward the galley. Behind her, Veronica sat silently on the crew seat, staring at nothing, her uniform still crisp, but it no longer gave her power. The laptop screen dimmed slightly, the PDF still open, and all across first class. People who had once avoided eye contact now looked at Isaiah directly, not because he demanded it, but because the truth had, and it was sitting calmly in seat 2A. The cabin of Flight 229 had never been quieter. Not during taxi, not during takeoff, not even during those brief moments of turbulence when trays rattled and seatbelts clenched tighter. But this silence was different. This was the silence that followed truth. Not the loud kind that demands a microphone, but the kind that sits down quietly and refuses to move. Isaiah Monroe wasn't talking anymore. The laptop sat closed beside him, the folder neatly tucked back into his briefcase. Aria Westbrook stood beside him with her arms crossed, calm as always. The work was done, at least for now. The evidence had been shown, the data exposed, and something irreversible had been set in motion. And yet, in seat 3C, someone else was just getting started. Maya Ellington rose slowly. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't wave her phone around or clear her throat for attention. She simply stood, steady and firm, like a tree that had always been growing but was only now being noticed. "I need to say something," she said, her voice soft but clear. Heads turned, slowly, as if afraid to acknowledge how deeply they'd been watching. Even Kimberly Dow paused in the galley, a bottle of ginger ale in hand, unsure if she should step forward or just listen. Maya took a breath. "I've been filming since the moment Mr. Monroe was first questioned. Every word, every reaction, every silence. And I want to be very clear. I'm not doing this to go viral. I'm doing this because too many people get silenced by a system that pretends it didn't see what it just did. A few passengers looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Others, surprisingly, nodded. I watched a black man sit in silence while his legitimacy was questioned. Not because he did anything wrong, but because someone didn't believe he belonged. I watched a flight attendant escalate a situation that never should have existed, and I watched the rest of us pretend it wasn't happening. She turned toward Veronica Steele, who now sat on the fold-down crew seat, arms folded tightly, face pale. I don't know what you were thinking when you questioned him. Maybe you truly believed there was a system error. But ask yourself, how many times have you trusted the system when the passenger looked like you? Veronica didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Maya continued, I'm not here to cancel anyone. I don't care about vengeance. What I care about is accountability. Because if we can't name what's wrong, we'll keep repeating it. And this moment, this cabin, this flight, it's already repeating something that should have been left in the past. She turned back to Isaiah. You didn't ask to be a symbol today, but you became one. Not because you shouted, not because you fought, but because you stayed. Isaiah looked up at her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something ancient, a kind of gratitude born not from relief, but recognition. He nodded once. Maya sat down. Her hands were still trembling slightly as she placed her phone in her lap. Screen still lit. The video now had over 4.2 million views. She hadn't even posted the full version yet. Across the aisle, Douglas Price shifted in his seat. The grin that once danced on his face had vanished. He looked uncomfortable now. Not because he disagreed, but because he didn't know how to sit inside the truth he had helped create. Captain Ray Dawson stepped out from the cockpit again. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, letting the silence hold. It had power now, not from intimidation, but from meaning. He walked slowly to the center of the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm. "I want to acknowledge what just happened here. Not just the earlier incident, but what we've all witnessed in the last 20 minutes. The cabin stayed quiet. Sometimes, leadership means making sure the plane takes off on time. And sometimes, it means recognizing when something more important is happening before we even leave the gate." He turned toward Veronica. "I've asked Flight Officer Steele to step away from service for the remainder of this flight. This decision wasn't made lightly, but it was made because passengers deserve better than silent apologies and invisible consequences." Veronica still didn't look up. The captain turned to Isaiah. "Mr. Monroe, on behalf of this flight crew, I apologize for what happened. Not because of your position, not because of your name, but because you should have been respected the moment you stepped on board." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Thank you, Captain." Dawson gave a respectful nod, then returned to the cockpit. Kimberly Dow took a cautious step forward. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "Mr. Monroe," she began, "I want to say something as well." He looked up. She swallowed. "I should have spoken sooner. I saw what was happening. I felt it, but I followed the lead instead of my instinct. I was trained to enforce rules, but I forgot how to read the room." She paused, then added, "I'm sorry." Isaiah nodded again, this time more slowly. "Thank you, Ms. Dow." He meant it. She stepped back, cheeks flushed, and resumed her position near the galley. In row 1, A woman in her 70s reached over and gently placed her hand on her husband's. She didn't speak, but the gesture wasn't lost on anyone watching. Even small moments had weight now. Maya leaned over to her seatmate, whispered, "They're calling it the 2A moment." He turned to her, confused. "Online," she clarified. "That's what they're calling it. The 2A moment. Like Rose's bus seat, like the Greensboro lunch counter." He looked at her, surprised. "You think it's that big?" She nodded. "It already is." Isaiah overheard the exchange. He didn't smile, but his eyes closed briefly, not out of fatigue, but reverence, because it was never just a seat. It was a mirror. And, finally, people were looking into it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the jet bridge finally began to retract. But no one was thinking about departure procedures anymore, not even the flight attendants. Whatever timeline the airline had mapped out for Flight 229 had been overtaken by something none of them could have scheduled truth unfolding mid-airport, without warning and without apology. Isaiah Monroe sat still in 2A. Not as a man seeking attention, but as someone holding space for others to witness a shift. The kind of shift that didn't just rattle headlines, it rattled understanding. He had not asked to become the story, and yet the moment demanded it nearby. Aria Westbrook's phone buzzed again. She glanced down. A message from corporate legal, then another from public affairs, then one from internal compliance. 6.1 million views and climbing. National press outlets requesting statements. CNN, BBC, and 2 university deans asking for interview requests. Someone had even mentioned a documentary deal already. Aria didn't react. She simply locked the phone and tucked it away. The story was moving fast, but Isaiah, he moved at his own speed, a steady rhythm that others would need to match. Kimberly Dow stood frozen near the galley, watching him from a distance. She hadn't returned to full duty. Not really. She continued offering drinks and passing through with grace. But her steps were different now. Lighter in some places, heavier in others. A woman relearning how to stand after realizing she'd been leaning too long in the wrong direction. The weight of complicity had settled on her like morning fog. Back in her jump seat, Veronica Steele hadn't spoken since the captain removed her from service. Her hands stayed folded across her lap. Her face, once commanding, now reflected someone unraveling from the inside. Not out of victimhood, but out of reckoning. She wasn't crying. Not visibly, but her stillness spoke louder than tears. Douglas Price sat beside the window across from Isaiah. His legs were crossed, but his arms weren't. One hand tapped his thigh rhythmically. The other fidgeted with his wedding band. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't muttering comments under his breath. He wasn't even trying to make eye contact. The glow of his phone screen illuminated the side of his face. He scrolled through a flood of reposts, headlines, and comments. Passenger in 2A holds his ground. Monroe moment sparks national dialogue. When silence becomes protest. Flight 229. He stopped on a video one posted just moments ago by Maya Ellington. It showed him, his own face, leaning into the aisle, whispering that line he thought no one had caught. "Guess first class is getting more inclusive." Now, it had been viewed nearly 200,000 times. Douglas's stomach tightened. His career wasn't built on sensitivity. It was built on leverage and silence. But he suddenly realized that silence, in this moment, was not his ally. It was his indictment. He set the phone down on his tray table, stared at it, then looked up. Isaiah was gazing out the window again, shoulders relaxed, like someone who had made peace with the burden others insisted on giving him. Douglas leaned forward. "Look, I don't know if an apology even matters now." But Isaiah didn't turn. "Then maybe it's not time to offer one," he replied, his voice even. Douglas sat back slowly. He had walked into the conversation expecting redemption, but Isaiah wasn't here for that. Not today. Further back in the cabin, passengers whispered among themselves, not gossip, but reflection. "I've flown 100 times. Never saw it like that before. Did you hear what she said about the audit? I feel like I've missed something big all these years. They weren't just processing an event, they were untangling their own place inside it." Isaiah closed his eyes. He thought about his daughter, 10 years old, bright as morning. He thought about her first day at her private school last fall, how one teacher assumed she was in the wrong classroom because her uniform didn't fit perfectly. He remembered the tears she held back when she came home, pretending not to care. He had looked her in the eyes that night and said, "One day, you'll see people try to shrink you down. Just remember, their fear is smaller than your worth." And now, as he sat in 2A, that same lesson echoed inside him. He wasn't just sitting for himself anymore. He was sitting for her. Maya glanced over from her row, noticing the quiet transformation in the cabin. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small pin. Silver, with a single engraved number, 2A. She held it in her palm for a moment, then stood and walked forward. Gently, without fanfare, she placed it on Isaiah's tray table. He opened his eyes and looked down at it. "Found it in a vendor booth during a journalism conference," she said quietly. "Didn't mean anything at the time, but now." He picked it up, weighed it in his fingers. "It means something now." He finished for her. She nodded and returned to her seat. Arya watched the exchange from the aisle. She'd known Isaiah for nearly a decade. She had seen him negotiate international mergers and speak at global equity panels. But she had never seen him like this. Not silent out of restraint, but silent out of certainty. His strength today hadn't come from authority. It came from not leaving, from refusing to disappear when the world tried to make him feel invisible. She pulled out her phone again, typed a quick note to the company's board. "Hold statement until tomorrow. He's not done riding it." She looked at Isaiah once more. He was still staring at the pin. Then, slowly, he reached into his journal and began to write. When the wheels of Flight 229 finally left the tarmac, there wasn't the usual applause, no quiet cheers, not even the common rustle of relief. It was as if the aircraft itself had hesitated before climbing, uncertain if it was lifting off into altitude or history. In the front of the cabin, Isaiah Monroe adjusted his seatbelt, his journal now closed beside him. The silver 2A pin rested atop it, catching the light that filtered through the window. His posture was steady, hands loosely folded, eyes half closed as if deep in thought, but still anchored in the moment. Next to him, Arya Westbrook quietly reopened her laptop and turned the screen toward the aisle once again. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The passengers who could see it leaned in instinctively. She navigated back to the document from earlier, the internal cultural audit. This time, she opened a bookmarked section titled Phase 3 Behavioral Findings. Kimberly Dow, now standing just 2 rows behind, paused mid-step when she saw the bold text on the screen. She took a breath. Arya looked at Isaiah, who gave a small nod. She began to read aloud. From January 2021 to December 2024, our third-party compliance team, in conjunction with internal ethics and equity monitors, conducted a randomized observational audit across major flight partners in North America. The objective was to identify recurring behavioral patterns impacting customer experience, with a focus on implicit bias, unequal treatment, and dignity-based service differentials. The wording was clinical, but every syllable struck like a confession. Arya continued, her voice calm but unwavering. Among over 100 reviewed interactions, 313 cases exhibited evidence of racial bias documented through either internal reports, passenger feedback, or third-party witness recordings. Of those 313 cases, 72% occurred in first-class or premium boarding zones. The overwhelming majority involved Black or Latino passengers being questioned about the legitimacy of their seating assignments or loyalty status. Despite having valid credentials, the numbers hung in the air like humidity. Even those who didn't understand statistics could feel the weight of them. Douglas Price shifted again in his seat. He had stopped pretending to work on his tablet. Now, he simply stared out the window, though his reflection stared back with a discomfort he couldn't quite swallow. Veronica Steele, still seated on the crew jump seat, turned her head slowly toward the aisle. Her face was drawn, lips parted slightly, as if each word cut through her own rationalizations. She had said she was just following protocol, but now she could see it. This wasn't protocol. It was pattern. Arya continued, undeterred. In incidents reviewed, only 14% resulted in mandatory retraining of staff. Fewer than 4% led to disciplinary action. The remainder were dismissed as procedural misunderstandings or unsubstantiated claims. Kimberly lowered her gaze. She remembered moments, not just on this flight, but others when passengers of color had hesitated before boarding or sat in first class looking uncertain, already anticipating being challenged, and she remembered staying quiet. Too often. Isaiah spoke, softly. This isn't a report about bad people. It's a report about blind spots. He looked at the screen, then around the cabin. I don't need perfection from the system, but I do need acknowledgement that the system sees what it's doing. Maya Ellington had already begun drafting her article. The notes were flowing like breath. She had recorded the numbers, but more importantly, she had recorded the silence that followed each one. That was the part readers needed to feel, because it's not always about what's said. Sometimes it's what no one dares to answer. Captain Ray Dawson appeared again, leaning against the bulkhead just outside the cockpit door. He had watched the entire reading without interruption. He stepped forward now, his voice low but clear. Ms. Westbrook, Mr. Monroe. May I see the full document? Arya handed him the laptop without hesitation. He took it, walked toward the galley, and sat beside the jump seat where Veronica remained. For a long time, he didn't say anything. He just read, page after page, graphs, breakdowns, incident logs, redacted summaries. He saw his own airline's logo more times than he cared to count. When he reached the end, he looked at Veronica. I know you didn't mean to start this. She looked at him, her expression brittle. But we both know that doesn't excuse it, he said. She nodded slowly, the smallest of movements. I didn't see it. Captain, she whispered. He set the laptop down and looked at her with a gentleness that still carried weight. No one ever does until it happens in front of 100 eyes and 6 million screens. He stood and returned the laptop to Arya. Thank you." She nodded in acknowledgement. Passengers were now whispering quietly. Not the casual kind of small talk, but the heavy kind, the kind people have after funerals or major life events. The kind where they try to name what they're feeling but don't quite have the words for it. A man in row 1 finally raised his hand slightly. "I just wanted to say, I travel every week, and I've probably seen this happen before, but I never questioned it." Isaiah turned to him. "That's the power of normalization. It numbs us to things we'd be outraged by if they happened to our sister, or father, or son." The man lowered his hand, then stood and walked over. He pulled something from his wallet, a business card with an embossed seal and his name printed in blue. "My company's launching a leadership program for young professionals," he said. "We've been looking for someone to speak about dignity in corporate culture." He handed the card to Isaiah. "If you're ever interested." Isaiah took the card but didn't commit. He simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, "but I think today already said enough." The man nodded back, then returned to his seat. Arya looked at Isaiah, her voice quiet now. "You know this is going to become something bigger, right?" He stared out the window again. "I hope it becomes something quieter." She tilted her head. "How so?" He looked at her. "I don't want applause. I want reflection." And for the first time all flight, she smiled, because that was the difference between performance and purpose. He wasn't trying to change the narrative. He was just asking people to finally read it. 37,000 feet above the Atlantic. The passengers of Flight 229 weren't focused on turbulence, snacks, or duty-free catalogs. Something deeper had taken root. The silence between them had matured into awareness, and for a few, that awareness was beginning to grow uncomfortable. Kimberly Dow stood in the rear galley, holding a tray she hadn't moved in 5 minutes. Her hands trembled, not violently, but enough that she noticed it. She didn't know what she was afraid of more, the judgment of passengers, or her own conscience whispering, "Why didn't you speak up?" She had always prided herself on being professional, efficient, courteous. But now, none of those felt like virtues. Not when they stood next to the truth. And the truth was, she'd seen it before. Maybe not this loudly, not this visibly, but she'd seen passengers of color spoken to differently. She'd seen her colleagues make them repeat things twice, question their upgrades, look at their passports longer than necessary, and she had said nothing. Until now, she had never considered silence a choice. But Isaiah Monroe's silence was different. His was deliberate, measured, rooted, and it spoke louder than most protests she'd ever seen. Back in 2A, Isaiah was still writing. The 2A pen sat beside him, catching the dimmed cabin lights like a quiet spotlight. His pen moved slowly across the page, every few lines. He paused, not to think, but to feel. He wasn't journaling about the incident. Not anymore. He was writing a letter to his daughter, not one to explain what had happened, but to remind her who she was. My sweet Lauren. Today, someone tried to reduce me, not with words, not with action, but with a glance. A single moment of disbelief that said, "You don't belong here." And I stayed. Not for pride, not even for justice. I stayed so you would know, when the world tries to shrink you, you don't have to make yourself smaller to fit. Hold your seat, and when they ask how you got there, smile, because you know. He looked at the words, then gently closed the notebook, across the aisle. Douglas Price hadn't moved in a while. His face was pale, drained of its usual confidence. The phone in his lap had gone dark. But the thoughts in his head were loud, too loud. He remembered that morning, boarding the flight with his silver carry-on, expecting that first class would be filled with people like him, people who belonged. He hadn't questioned why he felt that way, until now. He turned toward Isaiah. "Mr. Monroe," he began, voice low. "I need to say something." Isaiah looked up, his gaze steady. Douglas cleared his throat. "I was wrong. Not just about you, about what I assumed, about what I thought this seat meant." He paused. "My father used to say, 'You earn your seat every day.' But I took mine for granted, and I'm realizing now that maybe I never really earned it. I just expected it." Isaiah didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "Understanding doesn't undo harm," he said, "but it's a start." Douglas nodded, then added, "If there's anything I can do to make it right," Isaiah cut in gently, "then start by making sure you never stay silent the next time you see it happening to someone else." Douglas nodded again, this time with conviction. Behind them, Veronica Steele hadn't moved from her seat in the galley. She looked out the small window, but saw nothing. Not sky, not clouds, just questions. When did I stop seeing people as people? When did uniform become armor? She thought about the training courses, the customer service pledges, the so-called diversity modules. She had passed them all, scored high, knew the policies, and yet, when Isaiah boarded, something inside her had reacted. "He doesn't look like he belongs." The words hadn't come from logic, they came from programming, from years of absorbing images, stories, attitudes that equated authority with whiteness, money with whiteness, belonging with whiteness. It wasn't policy, it was bias, and it lived in her skin like a shadow. She stood up and walked slowly to Isaiah's row. He looked up when she approached. Aria, seated beside him, tensed slightly but remained quiet. Veronica stopped just beside the armrest. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, sincere. "I can't undo what I did," she said, "but I want you to know, I see it now. I see what I didn't see before." Isaiah looked at her, searching her face, and he asked. She took a breath. "And I'm sorry, not just to you, but to every person I've doubted, every person I made feel like they needed to prove something." Isaiah nodded, then motioned to the seat across the aisle. "Sit," he said simply. She hesitated, then did as he asked. The two sat across from each other for a long moment. No longer flight attendant and passenger, just people. He leaned forward. "What will you do after this flight?" She looked at him, unsure. "I don't know." He nodded, then start by listening. Really listening. To the stories, to the silences, to the history behind the reactions. Veronica blinked. Eyes wet. "I will," she said. Isaiah sat back, gaze returning to the window. "That's all any of us can do. Learn, unlearn, begin again." Aria glanced at her watch. They were 30 minutes from landing. The captain had yet to make another announcement, but everyone knew this wasn't just a descent toward land. It was a descent toward consequence. Maya Ellington sat 2 rows back, still typing. Her fingers flew over the keys now. The article was nearly finished. She had the title. She had the story. What she didn't expect was the impact it would have. Before the wheels touched down, The draft would be forwarded to her editor, shared among colleagues, and scheduled for publishing within the hour. The headline would read, "Seat 2A in the flight that didn't stay silent," and the world would read it. But even before the story went live, the passengers on Flight 229 had already changed, not because of what happened, but because of what they could no longer pretend didn't. The first announcement came as the plane began its gradual descent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be landing at John F. Kennedy International Airport in approximately 20 minutes. Please ensure your seatbacks are upright and tray tables stowed." It was the same calm, professional tone passengers heard on every flight. But for those aboard Flight 229, it sounded different now, like the closing lines of a story they hadn't expected to be part of. Isaiah Monroe sat upright, journal back in his bag, tray table secured. Outside the window, the lights of New York City shimmered faintly through a misty layer of clouds. The city was preparing to welcome them. Unaware it was about to become the final stage of a moment the internet had already declared historic. Across from Isaiah, Veronica Steele hadn't returned to duty. Her uniform remained immaculate, but her posture had shifted, no longer rigid. It now carried something heavier than authority awareness. She'd spent the last 30 minutes rethinking everything: her training, her actions, her silence, and maybe, just maybe, her future. Kimberly Dow was checking seatbelts in the rear cabin, quietly asking if passengers needed anything else. There was a softness in her voice now, not forced politeness, but real care. She looked people in the eye. She paused to listen. She didn't want to go back to the way she'd done things before. Maya Ellington sat with her phone on airplane mode, the final draft of her article ready to send the second they hit the runway. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She wasn't just documenting a story. She was preserving a shift. One of those rare cultural moments that begin with discomfort and end with responsibility. In seat 1B, Douglas Price stared straight ahead. He hadn't opened his phone again since Isaiah turned him down earlier. He'd stopped trying to speak, stopped trying to make it right with words. The only thing left was action. The question was whether he'd follow through once the cameras stopped. Isaiah watched the clouds part as the ground came into view. The moment he boarded, he had hoped for a quiet flight. He had hoped to finish notes for a presentation. But now he understood that some stories write themselves into the air, whether you're ready or not. He glanced to his left. Aria Westbrook had already pulled out a fresh notepad. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were sharp, scanning every reaction. She didn't miss much, and Isaiah knew she was already planning next steps: internal briefings, legal coordination, maybe even congressional calls. She was that kind of sharp, but still human. "Do you think this is going to change anything?" she asked him softly. Isaiah took a breath. "It already has." He didn't mean the media storm, not the trending hashtags or the thousands of reposts. He meant the way the passengers sat differently now, quieter, more aware. Like they were finally realizing flying first class didn't mean flying above reality. He looked down at the 2A pin in his hand and turned it over gently. Behind them, a mother in row 5 leaned toward her teenage son. "Are you okay?" she whispered. The boy nodded slowly. He had been watching since the beginning, watching Isaiah, watching the silence, the dignity, the refusal to be moved. "I think I understand now," he said. His mother smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I wish you didn't have to. Captain Ray Dawson made a second announcement. We've been instructed to taxi to a special gate upon arrival. Please remain seated until we come to a full stop. That raised eyebrows. A special gate. Even Arya looked up. Isaiah didn't flinch. 10 minutes later, the tires touched down with a muted thump. The brakes hissed gently as the aircraft slowed. Outside, the runway lights glowed like stars stretched across asphalt. But it wasn't the landing that made the passengers stir. It was what they saw waiting at the gate. 2 airport security officials, 3 representatives from the airline's corporate office, and a woman in a navy blue pantsuit holding a leather-bound folder with the company's crest stamped in silver. Maya's eyes widened. She recognized the woman, Judith Thompson, Chief Ethics Officer, and the last person who ever showed up at the gate of a domestic flight. As the aircraft rolled to a stop, the chimes sounded and the seatbelt signs flicked off. "Ladies and gentlemen," said the captain, "we ask that you remain seated for just a few more minutes. We'll be deplaning shortly, beginning with first class. Thank you for your cooperation." The door opened. The air that flowed in wasn't just fresh, it was electric. The woman in the navy suit stepped aboard. She scanned the cabin until her eyes found Isaiah. Then she stepped forward. "Mr. Monroe, my name is Judith Thompson," she said quietly. "May I have a word?" He stood, meeting her gaze. Of course, the passengers in first class were still seated, wide-eyed. "I'd prefer to speak in private," Judith said. Arya rose, stepping beside Isaiah. "He prefers transparency," she replied calmly. Judith hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." She reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Thick stock, watermarked, a formal notice. "I'm here to inform you that an internal investigation has been launched regarding this flight's events. Flight Officer Steele has been placed on immediate suspension. Formal retraining for all first-class service staff is scheduled to begin within 72 hours. Pending review." Veronica, hearing her name, turned away slightly. Isaiah listened silently. "There's more," Judith continued. "The board has agreed to a joint task force on equity protocol enforcement, and they've requested your input. Should you be willing?" Isaiah took the paper and read it briefly. Then he looked up. "None of this matters if it only changes a few people." Judith nodded slowly. "I know, but it's a start." He folded the letter, placed it in his bag, and replied, "Then let's make sure it's not the end." Judith stepped back, her voice quieter now. "We're grateful for your grace." Isaiah didn't smile. "Don't be grateful. Be better." He turned, nodded to Arya, and took his bag. Passengers began to clap softly, not the kind of applause reserved for celebrities or heroes. It was something gentler, almost reverent, a recognition that they had all been present for something important. He didn't wave, he didn't bow. He simply stepped into the jet bridge and disappeared from view. The terminal buzzed with its usual chorus of boarding announcements, rolling luggage, and hurried steps. But Gate B-18 was different. Gate B-18 had gone quiet, inside the lounge area. Passengers from Flight 229 moved slowly, many still glancing back at the aircraft through the wide window as if they hadn't truly left it behind. Some scrolled through their phones, already seeing headlines flood the news feed. Others just sat, staring at nothing in particular, processing what they had lived through. Maya Ellington stood near the window, phone in hand, waiting for her editor's response. She had filed the story the moment the plane touched down. Less than 10 minutes later, it was already the most read article on 3 national platforms. The headline was bold: "The Seat That Stayed." A black man's refusal to move becomes a movement. She'd chosen that title carefully. Isaiah Monroe hadn't given a speech. He hadn't staged a protest. But his refusal to move had done something far bigger than yelling ever could. It had made the world sit up and look in the mirror. Back inside the terminal, Veronica Steele stood alone near a vending machine. She had taken off her name badge. Her shoulders slumped as though the uniform itself had become heavier with every step she took. She had replayed the moment in her head over and over, her voice, firm but detached, questioning his ticket, calling security, assuming the worst. Now she understood it wasn't just one moment. It was 1,000 moments she hadn't questioned before. And now she couldn't unsee them. Behind her, Kimberly Dow approached, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. "I didn't know if you wanted one," she said softly. Veronica turned, surprised, and accepted the cup with a small nod. They stood in silence for a moment. "You think he'll forgive us?" Veronica asked. Kimberly didn't answer right away. "I don't think he needs to," she said finally. "I think the question is whether we're going to forgive ourselves and do something about it." Veronica looked at the reflection in the vending machine glass, her own eyes staring back. "I'm not sure how." "Then let's figure it out," Kimberly replied, but not quietly. Elsewhere in the terminal, Isaiah Monroe sat on a bench tucked near a quiet window overlooking the runway. The chaos of the terminal felt miles away. His journal sat open on his lap, a fresh page before him. He didn't write right away. He simply watched. Planes came and went. People rushed past, unaware of what had unfolded just beyond the glass. But for Isaiah, something had shifted permanently. And it wasn't just about airlines. It was about how a man could take up space not forcefully, not aggressively, but with quiet dignity. He finally began to write. Not to his daughter this time. To himself. Remember this moment. Remember how they looked at you, then looked again. Not because you changed, but because they finally saw. Not all will understand. Not all will change, but some will, and that's enough to keep sitting when the world wants you to stand down. Aria Westbrook appeared beside him, her heels soft on the floor. "You're needed," she said with a slight smile. He looked up. "Judith wants to schedule the first task force meeting. The board's asking if you'll co-chair." Isaiah closed his journal. "Only if it's not performative." Aria nodded. "It won't be. You shook the foundation today, and not with noise, with presence." He stood. "Then let's build something from that," as they turned to walk down the concourse. Isaiah paused. Ahead, a family waited near a boarding gate. A young black boy, no more than 8, sat in a chair marked "Priority." His mother whispered something to him, motioning for him to move, as a white man in a suit approached the gate. The boy stood halfway, then looked up and saw Isaiah watching. Their eyes met. Isaiah gave a subtle shake of the head. The boy blinked, then quietly sat back down. The man in the suit didn't object. In fact, he looked at the seat, then looked at the boy and chose a different one nearby. The moment lasted only seconds, but it said everything. Isaiah nodded once, then continued walking with Aria toward the elevator that would lead them out. 30 minutes later, Maya was on a phone call with a national morning show. They wanted Isaiah for a segment, a sit-down, maybe even a multi-part special. She agreed to pass the request along, but she already suspected what Isaiah's answer would be. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in change. 2 gates over, Douglas Price sat at a coffee bar. No phone, no laptop, just a napkin in front of him and a pen he'd borrowed from the cashier. He stared at the napkin like it owed him answers. He'd already emailed his HR department to schedule an internal review. He didn't know what it would uncover or how much of his own conduct it would put under the microscope. But he knew it was time. He couldn't walk away unchanged. Not this time. Back at Gate B-18 Airport, staff quietly removed a metal placard from the front row of the lounge. It had read, "First Class Only." In its place, they installed a new one, "Reserved Passenger 2A. Respect is not assigned by seating." It wasn't official branding, not yet. But someone in the terminal had printed it. Someone had made a choice. People paused to take photos. Some smiled. Some just stood and stared. And Isaiah. He was already outside, stepping into the back seat of a black town car. He gave no speech, no interviews. He just looked once more at the airport behind him before the car pulled away. He knew the internet would explode. He knew some would praise, others would critique, and a few would try to twist the truth. But he also knew something deeper. That sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is stay seated, especially when the world demands they move. This flight was never just about a seat. It was about respect, recognition, and the courage it takes to be seen as your full self in a world that too often denies it. Isaiah Monroe's quiet strength reminds us that dignity is not a privilege granted. It's a right claimed every day by those who refuse to be invisible. While we celebrate his courage, we must also confront the uncomfortable truth of ongoing discrimination and bias that persists behind polished uniforms and official policies. The silence of bystanders, the hesitation to speak, the assumptions we carry, these are the barriers that keep injustice alive. Together, we can choose to listen, to learn, and to stand beside those who face these battles in countless spaces, including those as ordinary as a flight seat. Thank you for joining this journey. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Stay with us. More stories of courage, truth, and change are coming soon, and your voice matters in this conversation.